The moment stretched into eternity as Korath stood over Yuna with his blades raised. And every being in the arena watched with held breath as the greatest warrior of the Varex Dominion faced the simplest choice of his entire life: strike or spare, kill or show mercy, prove that strength meant destruction, or discover that it might mean something else. And Tyra Luna looked up at him without flinching, her face pale from blood loss and her shoulders screaming with pain. But her eyes were steady and unafraid, because she had already made peace with whatever came next. "Your son is watching," she said quietly. So quietly that only Korath could hear. The Varex champion's arms trembled, and his breath came in harsh gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion. And behind his eyes, a war was being fought that made every battle he had ever won seem trivial by comparison. "I have killed hundreds in this arena," he said, his voice cracking on the words. "I have never hesitated. I have never questioned. I have never felt anything but pride when my blades found their mark." "And how do you feel now?" Yuna asked as Korath closed his eyes. And when he opened them again, something had changed in their yellow depths. Something that the Varex did not have a word for because they had spent centuries pretending it did not exist. "I feel tired," he admitted. "I feel so tired of killing, and I never knew that until this moment." From his platform, Thraxus was still screaming commands, his voice growing hoarse as he demanded that Korath fulfill his duty and uphold Varex honor and end this madness before it spread any further. But the crowd had stopped listening to their supreme commander. Instead, they watched their champion, this legend who had seemed so invincible just an hour ago, as he stood frozen above an unarmed human woman and struggled with a question that none of them had ever thought to ask. What if there was another way? Korath drew back his primary blade, the great curved sword that had ended more lives than anyone could count. And the crowd gasped as he prepared what looked like a killing stroke. Yuna did not close her eyes. She simply waited, trusting in the hope that had brought her to this moment, trusting in her brother's belief that mercy could move mountains. If someone was brave enough to offer it first, Korath's blade came down with all of his considerable strength and buried itself in the stone floor beside Yuna's feet. Sound of metal striking rock echoed through the suddenly silent arena like a thunderclap. And Korath released his grip on the weapon and stepped back with something like wonder spreading across his scarred face. "I cannot kill you," he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the arena because the amplifiers had not been designed to account for silence this complete. "I will not kill you, because you have shown me a courage that my people have forgotten how to recognize." He turned to face the crowd, spreading his forearms wide as if inviting them to see him clearly for the first time. This human stood alone against the greatest champion of the Dominion, he announced. She was wounded, she was outnumbered, she was facing certain death, and yet she chose to put down her weapon rather than become what she was fighting against. His eyes found Theron in the crowd, and his voice softened even as it continued to carry across the arena. "My son asked me what I wanted him to learn today," Korath said, "and I told him I wanted him to learn strength. But I was wrong about what that word means." He pointed at Yuna, this small bleeding human woman who had somehow changed everything by refusing to fight. "True strength is what she showed us," he declared. "True strength is being willing to die for something greater than victory. True strength is offering mercy when revenge would be easier. True strength is looking at your enemy and choosing to see them as someone who might become something better." In the stands, a warrior near the front slowly drew his blade from its sheath, and Yuna felt her heart clench with fear that this was all about to fall apart despite everything. But the warrior did not point his weapon at her. Instead, he drove it into the stone in front of him, just as Korath had done. And then he sat down with his hands empty and his head bowed. Another warrior did the same, and then another. And then the sound of metal striking stone began to ripple through the arena like rain falling on a roof, spreading outward from where Korath stood until hundreds of Varex blades stood buried in the ancient floor. Thraxus screamed for order, screamed for loyalty, screamed for someone to remember what the Varex stood for. But his voice was lost in the growing chorus of warriors who were choosing, perhaps for the first time in their lives, to lay down their weapons. The young boy Theron ran from his seat and down to the arena floor, and he threw his small arms around his father's leg and looked up at him with eyes full of something that the Varex called weakness, but that Una knew had another name entirely. "I am proud of you, Father." The child said. Korath knelt down to embrace his son, and when he rose again there were tears on his face that he made no effort to hide. "The human has won," he announced to the arena, to his people, to the galaxy that watched through countless screens and recordings. "Not by killing our champion, but by showing us that we do not have to be what we have always been." He walked to where Una stood swaying with exhaustion and blood loss, and he extended one massive hand to steady her before she could fall. "Your colony is safe," he said. "And if I have any say in what comes next, there will be no more war between our peoples." Thraxus stood alone on his platform now, abandoned by the warriors who had followed him for decades, and his face was twisted with rage and disbelief as he watched everything he had built crumble around him. "This is not over," he snarled. But even he did not seem to believe it. In the observer section, the Theshan ambassador turned to address the representatives from 12 different species, their silver form pulsing with barely contained emotion. "Remember this day," they said, "because the galaxy just changed in ways that none of us could have predicted. And it changed because one small human woman was brave enough to put down her sword." The Minari ambassador nodded slowly, his earlier contempt replaced by something that looked remarkably like respect. "The humans are not prey," he said quietly. "I do not think they ever were." Medical personnel rushed onto the arena floor to tend to Una's wounds, and as they worked, she looked up at the red sky of the Varex homeworld and thought about her brother. "I found another way," she whispered. "Just like I promised." Months later, Una stood before Jihun's memorial on New Seorak. Her shoulder healed, but the scar remaining as a reminder of everything that had happened in that arena behind her. A delegation of Varex diplomats waited patiently, led by Korath himself, who had become the unlikely champion of a new movement that was slowly changing his people from the inside out. "The war is over," she told the simple stone marker. "And it ended not because we were stronger, but because someone was brave enough to show mercy first." She placed a small flower on the memorial and stepped back to rejoin the delegation across the galaxy. In Varex schools and homes and ships, children asked to hear the story of the human who won a battle without killing anyone, and their parents found themselves unable to explain why that story made them feel something they had never felt before. The tale was already becoming legend, and legends, as Una knew better than anyone, had the power to change the world. The silence in the arena was so complete that Una could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears, and she knew that the next few minutes would determine the fate of Billions. Korath stood motionless with his 4 blades still raised, his eyes fixed on her face as if he was searching for something he could not name. And behind him, the crowd of Varex warriors waited with expressions that had shifted from bloodlust to uncertainty. "Your brother sounds like he was a fool," Korath said at last. But his voice lacked conviction, and the words came out more like a question than a statement. "Maybe he was," Una agreed. And she saw surprise flicker across the Varex champion's face at her willingness to concede the point. "But I would rather be a fool who dies protecting the helpless than a wise warrior who lives by stepping on the weak." She paused to press her hand harder against her shoulder wound, feeling the blood seeping through her fingers and knowing that she was running out of time. "Let me ask you something, Korath," she said, and I want you to think about your answer before you speak. Ask, he replied. And his voice was quieter now. Almost thoughtful, Yuna looked past him toward the stands, scanning the crowd until her eyes found the young Varek's child who had been watching the fight with such intense attention. The same child who had asked his father why the tiny human would not fall. That boy up there, she said, nodding toward the child, the one in the third row who keeps asking questions. Is he yours? Korath stiffened, and his grip tightened on his weapons in a way that told Yuna she had touched something important. My son, he admitted. His name is Theron, and I brought him here to watch his father defend the honor of the Dominion. What do you want him to learn from today? Yuna asked. The question hung in the air between them, simple and devastating, and Korath's face shifted through emotions that Yuna doubted he had ever allowed himself to feel in public before. I want him to learn strength, Korath said at last. I want him to learn that the Vareks are the greatest warriors in the galaxy, and that our enemies fall before us like grain before the harvest blade. And is that what he is learning right now? Yuna pressed. Is he watching his father demonstrate unquestionable strength? Or is he watching his father struggle to understand why a small wounded human woman refuses to die the way she is supposed to? Korath made a sound that was almost a growl, but it lacked the fury of his earlier roars and instead carried something that sounded almost like pain. You speak too much, he said. My brother always said the same thing. Yuna replied with a small smile that probably should not have been possible given the circumstances from his platform. Thraxus leaned forward with rage burning in his eyes, and his voice cracked like a whip across the arena. I gave you an order. Korath, the Supreme Commander shouted. Kill the human now, or I will have you stripped of your rank and your honor and everything you have ever earned. Korath did not turn to face his commander, did not acknowledge the threat, did not react at all, except to let his shoulders drop slightly as if a weight was settling onto them. Tell me about human history, he said to Yuna, and the request was so unexpected that even she needed a moment to find her response. What do you want to know? Your species is young, Korath said. Barely 1,000 years removed from fighting each other with sticks and stones. And yet you have spread across 100 worlds and built civilizations that rival empires 10 times your age. And I want to know how that is possible. Yuna understood what he was really asking, and she chose her next words with the care of someone placing bets on which path through a minefield might not explode. We killed each other, she said. For thousands of years, we fought wars over territory and resources and religion and pride. And we burned cities and slaughtered children and committed horrors that still haunt our collective memory. She saw the Vareks in the crowd nodding slightly, as if this matched their expectations of how a proper species should behave. But then something changed. She continued. And some of us started asking whether there might be another way. And they were called fools and dreamers and traitors by those who believed that strength only came from violence. And what happened to these fools and dreamers? Korath asked. Some of them died, Yuna admitted. Many of them died, because changing the way people think is harder than winning any battle. But enough of them survived and kept speaking and kept showing by example that mercy could be a form of strength. 2. She gestured at the arena around them with her sword, taking in the ancient stones and the watching crowd and the weight of centuries of Varek's tradition. My people still fight, she said. We are here in this arena because we were willing to defend our colony world with force if necessary. But we also learned that every enemy we destroy creates new enemies among their children and their friends and their allies. The cycle of violence, Korath said. And there was recognition in his voice now. Jihoon called it the trap that only the brave can escape, Yuna confirmed. Because it takes no courage to kill someone who hurt you. That is the easiest thing in the universe. But it takes tremendous courage to look at your enemy and choose to find another path. In the stands, Theron tugged at his father's arm again. But this time, the older Varex was paying attention with eyes that had finally stopped crying but remained red and wet. "Father," the child said in a voice loud enough to carry in the unnatural silence. "I want to be like her when I grow up." The words rippled through the crowd like a shockwave, and Yuna saw expressions changing on faces throughout the arena as the simple declaration of a child cut through centuries of conditioning. Korath looked up at his son, and something in his face broke open in a way that could not be hidden or taken back. "Enough of this," Thraxus bellowed, rising from his seat and pointing at Yuna with one massive claw. "I do not care about human philosophy or children's foolish wishes. This combat ends now." He turned to address the crowd, spreading his arms wide as if to embrace them all in his conviction. "We are the Varex Dominion," he roared. "We have conquered 62 worlds and crushed every species that dared to stand against us. And we will not be lectured by some tiny soft creature who cannot even defend herself properly." The crowd stirred, and Yuna could feel the momentum shifting, could feel centuries of tradition and pride pushing back. Against the doubt she had managed to plant, she had one chance left. Yuna lowered her sword until the point touched the ground, and then she released it entirely, letting the blade fall from her fingers to clatter against the ancient. Stone's every eye in the arena fixed on her, as she stood unarmed and bleeding before the greatest warrior the Varex had ever produced. "I will not fight anymore," she announced, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the arena. "If you need to kill an unarmed woman to prove your strength, then do it." She looked up at where Theron sat watching with wide eyes, and she spoke her next words directly to the child. "Let your son see what Varex honor truly means." The challenge hung in the air, and the arena itself seemed to hold its breath. Korra stared at the weapon lying at his feet, and then he stared at the defenseless human who had just handed him victory, and his four hands trembled on the hilts of his blades. "Pick up your sword," he said, and his voice was almost pleading. "No." Yuna replied simply. "Pick it up," he repeated. "Louder now." "No." Thraxus was screaming something from his platform, but his words had become meaningless noise against the roaring silence that filled Korath's head. Everything he had ever believed told him to strike, to end this, to prove that the Varex way was the only way. But his son was watching, and for the first time in his life, Korath was not sure what lesson he wanted to teach. Supreme Commander Thraxus slammed his fist against the stone railing of his platform hard enough to crack it, and his voice thundered across the arena with enough force to silence even the confused chaos of the crowd. "This is not how combat works," he roared. "This is not how the arena of judgment has ever worked, and I will not allow some weak human to make a mockery of our most sacred traditions." Yuna stood her ground, her shoulders still bleeding freely, and her breath coming harder now as her body fought to keep up with the demands she was placing on it. But her voice remained steady when she spoke. "I have not broken any rules," she said, loud enough for the amplifiers to carry her words to every corner of the arena. "Your traditions say that combat continues until one champion cannot fight or will not fight, and I am still standing and still willing." The crowd muttered at her words, and Yuna could see Varex warriors turning to each other with uncertainty on their faces, because she was technically correct about the ancient laws that governed this place. Arath had not moved since she stepped back from her killing blow, and he watched her now with an expression that shifted between rage and confusion and something that might have been curiosity. "You could have ended this," he said, and there was an accusation in his voice, but also a genuine question. "You had your blade at my throat, and you chose not to strike. And I want to know why any warrior would throw away certain victory." Yuna looked at him, this massive creature who had killed hundreds in this very arena, and she saw past the scars and the muscle and the reputation to something underneath that the Varex themselves probably did not recognize. She saw a warrior who was tired, "Can I tell you a story?" she asked. And the question was so unexpected that Korath actually laughed. "A story?" he repeated, shaking his head with disbelief. "We are in the middle of sacred combat, and you want to tell me a story? My brother used to tell me stories," Yuna said. And she let the pain of those memories show on her face, because hiding it served no purpose now. "His name was Ji-hoon, and he was a better fighter than me in every way. And he died 6 months ago when your raiders attacked a transport ship that was carrying refugees from a border colony." The crowd grew quiet again, not out of respect but out of confusion, because enemies did not share personal stories during combat, and no one knew how to react to this breach of every expectation. That transport had no weapons. Yuna continued, her eyes locked on Korath's face. It had no military value. It was just carrying families who were trying to escape the war zone. And your ships tore it apart anyway, because that is what Varek ships do. Korath's expression hardened, and Yuna saw him shift his grip on his blades as if preparing to attack again. "We are warriors," he said, "and warriors fight. And those who cannot defend themselves are simply casualties of a universe that rewards strength above all else. My brother believes something different," Yuna said, "and the last thing he did before he died was prove it." She paused, gathering her strength for what came next. And when she spoke again, her voice was clear despite the pain and the blood loss and the 1,000 ways. This gamble could still end with her death. When the raiders breached the transport hull, Ji-hoon could have reached the escape pods in time to save himself. But he did not run because there were Varek civilians in the cargo hold. The muttering in the crowd changed pitch, and Yuna saw confusion ripple across alien faces as they struggled to process what she had just said. "They were Vareks on a human transport ship?" Korath asked. And for the first time, his voice held something other than contempt. "Refugees from one of your border worlds," Yuna explained. "Families who fled because their colony was caught between your expansion and another empire's counterattack. And our ship was the only one that would take them because no one else wanted to risk angering the Dominion." She let that information settle before continuing, and she watched the doubt grow in Korath's eyes as he tried to fit this new truth into his understanding of how humans behaved. "My brother spent his last minutes helping Varek's mothers and children reach the escape pods," Yuna said. "He carried Varek's wounded on his back while the ship burned around him. And when the raiders finally cut through to the hold, they found a human soldier standing alone between them and a group of Varek civilians. The arena was utterly silent now. They killed him, of course." Yuna continued, and her voice cracked just slightly on those words before she steadied it again. "They killed him, and then they killed the civilians he died trying to protect. And the last transmission from the transport showed my brother on his knees with a Varek's blade at his throat." She looked directly at Korath. And then she looked at Thraxus on his platform. And then she looked at the thousands of Varek's warriors who filled the stands. "Do you know what his last words were?" she asked. And no one answered because no one could find words to speak. "He said that he forgave them." The sound that escaped the crowd was not a roar or a cheer or anything that could be easily named. It was something closer to a collective exhale of shock, and perhaps something else that the Vareks did not have a word for. "Your brother died protecting our people," Korath said slowly, as if testing the words to see if they could possibly be true. And with his dying breath, he offered forgiveness to his killers. "Yes," Yuna said simply. "Why would any warrior do such a thing?" Yuna raised her sword, not in threat, but in a kind of salute to something invisible that existed between them now. Because Ji-hoon believed that real strength is not about how many enemies you can destroy, she said. It is about how many people you can protect. And it is about having the courage to choose mercy when everyone expects you to choose violence. Korath stared at her. And in the stands, the young Varek's child tugged at his father's arm again. "Father." The the boy said. "Why are you crying?" The father did not answer because he did not know. Because Varek's warriors were not supposed to cry, and yet his face was wet with tears. He could not explain. Thraxus rose from his seat, his expression twisted with rage and something that might have been fear. And his voice shook when he shouted his command across the arena. "End this now, Korath. Kill the human, and let us be done with this madness." Korath looked up at his supreme commander, and then he looked back at the small wounded woman who stood before him with blood on her shoulder and grief in her eyes and absolutely no fear in her heart. And what would that prove? He asked quietly. And the question was not meant for Thraxus. Yuna felt hope kindle in her chest for the first time since she stepped into this arena. And she held tight to it as she prepared to say the words that would either save her people or condemn them. The fight had become something else entirely, and the hardest part was still to come. The arena stretched vast and circular under a sky the color of dried blood. And Captain Yuna Siang stood at its center, feeling the weight of 1 billion human lives pressing down upon her shoulders. She was not tall, not heavily muscled, not covered in the ceremonial armor that warriors of 100 species wore when they stepped into the Varek's arena of judgment. And she knew that every alien eye watching her saw weakness where she saw something else entirely. The Varex had demanded this trial by combat when their warships appeared above New Siarik 3 months ago. And the terms had been simple in the way that only truly cruel things could be simple. Send a champion or watch your colony burn. Yuna had volunteered before the transmission even finished playing around. The stands rose in great curved tiers carved from black stone, filled with thousands of Varek's warriors who had traveled across their empire to witness what they believed would be a quick and entertaining execution. And their growls and roars created a sound like distant thunder that never stopped rolling. The Varek's were massive creatures, standing nearly 3 meters tall, with skin like cracked granite and 4 arms that ended in claws, capable of tearing through starship hull plating. And they had conquered 62 worlds across 3 centuries through nothing but violence and the worship of violence. Supreme Commander Thraxus sat upon an elevated platform at the north end of the arena, his ceremonial cloak of enemy bones draped across shoulders wider than Yuna was tall. And when he raised one massive fist, the crowd fell into immediate silence. "The humans have sent their champion," Thraxus announced, his voice amplified to reach every corner of the arena. "And I must say that I am disappointed." Laughter rippled through the Varek spectators, a harsh barking sound that echoed off the ancient stones. "Look at this creature," Thraxus continued, gesturing toward Yuna with obvious contempt. "So small that a Varek's child could crush her. So fragile that our air itself seems too heavy for her lungs. So foolish that she carries only a simple blade when she could have brought weapons of real power." Yuna said nothing because there was nothing yet worth saying. She simply stood with her feet planted and her eyes forward, her single sword held loosely at her side, her breathing slow and measured, despite the fear that coiled in her stomach like a living thing in the stands reserved for neutral observers. Ambassadors from 12 different species watched with expressions ranging from pity to curiosity, and Yuna knew that most of them had already written humanity off as another doomed species that would soon exist only in historical records. The Deshan ambassador, a being of flowing silver light, leaned toward their Corvan neighbor and spoke words that Yuna's translator picked up clearly. "The humans must have no warriors left if this is the best they could send." Yuna allowed herself a small smile that no one was close enough to see. "Bring forth the champion of the Dominion," Thraxus commanded, and the crowd erupted into fresh roaring as a gate on the southern end of the arena ground opened with the shriek of ancient metal. Korath emerged from the darkness beyond that gate like a nightmare. Given physical form, he stood even taller than most Varek's. his gray skin covered in ritual scars that told the story of 200 victories in this very arena. And he carried a blade in each of his 4 hands. Each weapon longer than Yuna was tall. His eyes found her across the distance between them. And in those yellow depths, she saw nothing but absolute certainty that she would die within the next few minutes. "I am Korath," he bellowed as he strode toward the center of the arena. "And I have killed champions from 37 worlds. And I have never faced an opponent who lasted longer than it takes to draw 10 breaths." The crowd chanted his name, thousands of voices merging into a single thunderous sound. And Korath raised all 4 arms to receive their worship like a god, accepting prayers from his faithful Yuna. Watched him approach and thought about her brother Ji-hoon, who had died 6 months ago on a transport ship that Virex raiders had torn apart just for sport. And she thought about the promise she had made as she held his body in the wreckage, while rescue ships finally arrived too late to matter. She had promised him that she would find another way. "Human," Korath said when he finally stood close enough that she had to crane her neck to meet his eyes. "Do you have any final words before I send you to whatever afterlife your pathetic species believes in?" Yuna looked up at the mountain of muscle and rage that towered above her. And she looked at the 4 blades that gleamed hungry in the red light. And she looked at the crowd that waited with barely contained excitement for her blood to stain the ancient stones. Then she looked back at Korath and said nothing. At all, the Virex champions seemed confused by her silence, perhaps expecting begging or defiance, or at least some acknowledgement of the death that awaited her. But Yuna simply settled deeper into her stance and let her sword hang ready. "So be it," Korath growled in the observer section. The Minari ambassador turned to his aide and spoke quietly. "Record everything, because the galaxy should remember what happens when humans reach beyond their grasp." Thraxus raised his fist once more, and when he let it fall, the arena exploded with sound as 10,000 Virex voices screamed for blood. Korath roared his battle cry, a sound that Yuna felt in her bones more than heard with her ears. And he launched himself forward with all 4 blades spinning in patterns designed to overwhelm any defense. Yuna watched him come, this wall of muscle and metal and murderous intent. And she thought one last time about Ji-hoon and about Nu Seorak and about all the humans across the galaxy who would learn their fate based on what happened in the next few minutes. Then, at the last possible moment, she moved not forward to meet his charge, not backward to flee from it, but sideways in a step so precise and so perfectly timed that Korath's blades passed through empty air. Where she had been standing, a heartbeat before the crowd's roar faltered just for an instant. As confusion rippled through the Virex spectators, Korath spun to face her, his eyes narrowing. And Yuna stood in her new position with her sword still held loosely at her side, as if nothing had happened. "Lucky." The Virex champion snarled. Yuna said nothing. She simply waited, her breathing still slow, her heart still steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Her eyes fixed on the warrior who would kill her if she made even one mistake in the observer section. The Deshan ambassador stopped glowing quite so dismissively and leaned forward with something that might have been interest. Korath charged again. And again Yuna was not where his blades expected her to be. And somewhere in the stands a young Virex child tugged at his father's arm and asked why the tiny human would not fall. The father had no answer. The fight had barely begun, and already something was happening that the Virex had never seen before. A human was still breathing. Korath's 4th charge ended the same way as the first 3, with his blades cutting nothing but air and the small human woman standing, untouched, a few steps away from where she had been a moment before the crowd had stopped roaring. 10,000 Virex warriors sat in confused silence, watching something that should have been impossible unfold on the sacred stones where their greatest champions had always triumphed without effort or Yuna felt the burn in her legs from the constant movement. and she felt the ache in her shoulders from holding her sword ready through each narrow escape. But she kept her breathing controlled and her expression calm, because showing weakness now would mean death. "Stand still," Korath bellowed, his voice cracking with frustration that clearly surprised even him. "Fight me like a warrior instead of dancing like prey." "I am fighting you," Yuna replied. And these were the first words she had spoken since the combat began. Korath snarled and launched another attack. This time slower and more controlled, his four blades weaving a pattern that left fewer gaps for her to slip through. And Yuna felt the edge of one sword whisper past her cheek, close enough to draw a thin line of blood. The crowd murmured at the sight of red. The first wound of the match, but it was not the fountain of human blood they had expected to see by now. Yuna continued to move, continued to evade, continued to study the rhythm of Korath's attacks the way her brother had taught her during all those years of training in their small apartment on New Siorak. Jihun had been the natural fighter in their family, gifted with speed and strength that made other soldiers look clumsy by comparison. But he had always insisted that his sister possessed something more valuable: the patience to watch and wait and learn while others exhausted themselves with fury. "Rage is a fire that burns hot but dies fast," he used to tell her during their sparring sessions. "And the fighter who keeps their flame steady will always outlast the one who burns brightest." Yuna carried those words with her now as Korath pressed his attack with growing desperation, his movements becoming wider and wilder as frustration clouded his judgment. She saw an opening, a brief gap in his defenses that appeared when he overextended on a downward strike. And she took it. Her blade moved faster than anyone expected, slicing a shallow cut across Korath's upper right arm. Before she flowed back out of his reach, the arena went completely silent. Varric's blood, thick and dark as oil, dripped onto the ancient stones for the first time in this match. And every spectator stared at the impossible sight of their greatest champion wounded by a creature they had dismissed as barely worth killing. "She cut him," the young Varric's child whispered to his father. And the father could only nod in stunned disbelief in the observer section. The Deshan ambassador had risen from their seat, their silver form pulsing with what might have been excitement or alarm or both. "The human moves like water flowing around stone," they said to no one in particular. "I have never seen anything quite like it." The Minari ambassador had stopped recording and was now simply watching with an expression that suggested his earlier certainty about the outcome had completely vanished. Korath looked down at the blood running down his arm, and when he raised his eyes to meet Yuna's gaze, there was something new there alongside: the rage, the first flicker of genuine respect. "You are better than I expected," he admitted. "But one small cut means nothing, and I have won battles with far worse wounds." "I know," Yuna said. "I am not trying to wound you to death." Korath's face twisted with confusion at her words. But he did not ask what she meant, because Varric's warriors did not waste time on conversation during combat. He attacked again. And this time Yuna was not quite fast enough. One of his lower blades caught her across the shoulder, cutting deep through muscle and sending a spray of red across the dark stones. And Yuna gasped at the pain but kept her feet and kept her sword up and kept moving. The crowd came back to life at the sight of her blood, roaring their approval as their champion finally drew real damage. But the sound was different now. Less certain, more questioning. Why was the human still standing when that wound should have sent her to her knees in agony? Why did she not cry out or beg for mercy the way other species always did when Korath cut them? Why did her eyes show pain but not fear, determination but not despair? Yuna pressed her free hand against the wound to slow the bleeding, knowing that she was running out of time now, knowing that she had to move this fight toward its true purpose before she lost too much blood to continue. Korath circled her like a predator that had finally tasted weakness, his earlier frustration replaced by the cold confidence of a hunter who knew his prey was injured. "You surprise me," he said, "but surprises do not win battles. And you cannot dodge forever with that wound slowing you down." Yuna knew he was right. She also knew that dodging had never been her plan till Winkerith came at her again. And Yuna let herself stumble slightly, let her guard drop just a fraction, and watched as the Virex champion took the bait and committed fully to what he thought would be the killing blow. But Yuna was not where he expected her to be. She moved inside his reach, past his spinning blades, so close that she could smell the copper scent of her own blood on his weapons. And she found herself standing with her sword point pressed against his throat. The crowd gasped as one. A sound of pure shock that echoed off the ancient wall Yuna had to kill. Had the opening that would end the fight and save her people. Had the perfect angle to drive her blade through Korith's neck before he could bring any of his 4 swords to bear. She did not take it instead. She stepped back, lowering her sword and leaving herself completely exposed to his counterattack. Korith froze, his blades raised but not falling, his eyes wide with something that looked almost like fear, but was really just total incomprehension. "Why?" he demanded. His voice barely above a whisper in the silent arena. Yuna met his gaze and said the words that would change everything. "I am not here to kill you." The crowd erupted into chaos. Thousands of Virex voices shouting questions and accusations and demands for explanation. And Supreme Commander Thraxus rose from his seat with his fists clenched in fury, but Korith just stood there, staring at the small, bleeding human who had just refused to take his life when every warrior code in the galaxy would have demanded she finish what she started. "I do not understand," he said. "I know," Yuna replied, "and that is why we need to talk in the observer section." Every ambassador had risen to their feet, and the Deshan turned to address them all with wonder in their voice. "I believe we are witnessing something that has never happened in Virex history. The sacred arena of judgment, built for death, had just become something else entirely, and the fight was far from over."